Good evening, everyone. I hope you're all well. It's a real pleasure to give you all a warm welcome here to St. Peter Mancroft Church this evening for this talk, which is part of the Norwich History Festival. My name is Joel Halcomb. I'm a lecturer in early modern history at the University of East Anglia, but I'm also the chairman of the Norfolk Record Society, who have organized this event along with the History Festival. And we're really excited. This is an event that the Record Society runs annually as we publish our annual volume of records on Norfolk history. And it's a really nice opportunity to coincide with the History Festival this year. So I hope that you all have had a real good opportunity to look at what's on offer through the History Festival, a whole series of fantastic talks and tours and exhibitions and performances around the city. But tonight is a particularly special occasion for the Record Society itself because it celebrates an incredible achievement of scholarship for us. This is the publication, this celebrates and launches the publication of the 8th and final volume of the long-running series on the papers of Nathaniel Bacon of Stiffkey or Stookie Hall in North Norfolk. As you will hear later, the Bacon Papers team and its various guises have been working for over 50 years to produce a complete scholarly edition of all of the papers of Nathaniel Bacon. And it's great to see that endeavor finally come to full fruition tonight. If you've not heard of us before, the Norfolk Record Society has been in existence since 1930, so almost 100 years. And over that time, we have been pursuing our charitable objective, which is to encourage the study and preservation of Norfolk records and to publish scholarly editions of documents relating to the history of this great county. And that's exactly what we're taking stock of this evening. We run a series of lectures and talks throughout every year. We have social events at historic sites and, of course, produce our annual scholarly edition. So if anyone would like to know more about what we do or if you would like to get involved, please speak to one of us or there's some leaflets at the back. Tonight, we celebrate our 89th volume. And collectively, this series of 89 volumes ranges from medieval cartularies to town and city records for Yarmouth and King's Lynn and Norwich, and right up to the 20th century with volumes on wartime diaries or the volume we published a couple of years ago on the socialist and suffragism movements in Norfolk, which won a prize for outstanding publication of historical records by the British Records Association. So we're very proud of what we do. We publish a wide range of historical documents. You can see many of those volumes on the table at the back, so if you haven't had a chance to look yet, then at the end, please do go have a browse at what we do. Well, that's who we are and why we're here tonight, and let me introduce our speaker. Many of you will know the Reverend Professor Dermot McCulloch from the BBC TV series and books on the history of Christianity, or his other series on how God made the English or sex in the church. He is professor of the history of the church at Oxford University and has published widely on church history across time. But for tonight's purposes, I might highlight his career as an early modern British historian, and a historian particularly of the Reformation years of the 16th century. He has produced what I'm sure most of us in the field consider the definitive biography of Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII's great man of government. And I think it's not inappropriate to say is undoubtedly one of the most important and influential historians working in Britain over the last half century. And I think that influence is partly because his works are always so timeless in their quality and their influence. To give you just one example, one of my favorite examples that has local relevance, an article he published way back in 1981 on Kett's Rebellion is still one of the go-to pieces to understand what happened up on Mousehold Heath above the city in 1549. Dermot has also been a long-standing supporter of the Bacon Papers project, so it is our great pleasure to welcome him here to give the final talk launching our final volume. Thank you, Dermot, and welcome.
Thanks for that very generous introduction. It's always a pleasure to come back to East Anglia and to Norwich in particular, and to this beautiful church in which I spoke only about a year ago on a very different subject from tonight. But we are very much celebrating this extraordinary achievement. I come to you as an interloper from Suffolk, from Cambridge and from Oxford now, to celebrate the arrival at the final port of call in the onward voyage of this great publishing project. It's worth developing that nautical image because the 8 volumes of the Stookie Papers edition have shown all the ambition and monumentality of a 30s ocean liner, worthy in stateliness and style to host an Agatha Christie murder story. We celebrate as Captain Emeritus the late Alfred Hassel-Smith, who earned his metaphorical gleaming white uniform and gold-braided peaked cap over half a century from the 1960s and 1970s, since this venture first took place in his mind. Here is Hassel, and I'm delighted, and it's a great surprise to me that his daughter Jenny is here tonight. It's really lovely, and other old friends here as well, who need no introduction to Hassel. There he is. There have been many captains on the bridge since Hassel to bring the ship finally into port. I think I've done my counting properly. We should honour 7 further scholars who have taken place at the helm in various combinations over the whole 8 volumes, and they all deserve a 21-gun salute, not least the final team of Barry Taylor and Alan Metters. But still, to vary the oceanic metaphor a little towards desert island discs, this extraordinary venture remains as from an idea by A. Hassel-Smith. And I had cause, since my postgraduate days 50 years ago, to value Hassel's kindness, his intellectual energy, his constant stimulation of academic curiosity, his warm hospitality, which made it such a pleasure for this callow doctoral student to drive up from Cambridge to Norwich in the 1970s for the research seminars at Keswick Hall. Hassel had a huge impact on what we mean by regional history and how we do it to show its true value. In the words of his friend and mine, the Cambridge historian, Professor John Morrell, Hassel's interests were broad, extending well beyond landscape, cultural, political, religious history to embrace the history of buildings, of material culture. Hassel did total history and told us how to do it. And throughout these volumes, one is constantly reminded of his patient probing of the mind of that long-dead, emotionally private, tidy-minded gentleman, Sir Nathaniel Bacon, and his faithful and well-matched servant, Martin Mann, as year by year they added to the archive at Stookie Hall, now brought back to life through the Norfolk Record Society's courage in following this project through, this audacious project. I do have form on celebrating these volumes. 16 years ago, back in 2010, I launched Volume 5 of this series in no less a setting than the pulpit of Stookie Church, in front of a packed congregation from the Lord Lieutenant downwards. Also, I'm glad to say, in front of Hassel, who had just taken the Norfolk Record Society on an animated tour round Stookie Hall and its grounds and gardens. I know that there are some here tonight who are present on that occasion and will remember its unexpected festiveness, certainly seared in my memory. The fine folk of Stewkey Church had honoured us on a chilly September night by turning up all the church heating and the church lighting. It soon transpired that this was unwise. 5 minutes after I began speaking, and I'm timing this any time now, suddenly all the church lights flickered and then went out. I continued in the dusk with the aid of some candles. But then there was a loud explosion outside, and I observed through the church window beside the pulpit an electric power point bursting into flames in the churchyard. The whole village of Stewkey had lost its power in honour of Sir Nathaniel Bacon. The fire brigade evacuated us all from the church, but eventually I was back in the pulpit, once more candle-lit, with the congregation in total darkness. Whatever I then said was accompanied for around half an hour or so by the sound and very visible sights of something like a New Year's Eve firework display, which needed both the fire brigade and the electricity company to bring it to an end. Perversely, the sounds and sights stopped at much the same time that I did. And it's unlikely that anyone there that night can remember a word of what I said. But picking up the last volume of the Stewkey Papers now, with its final tidying up of the life of Nathaniel Bacon, it's easy to miss all the other toils and accidents that have contributed to this series. It's an extraordinary feat of meticulous, ingenious detection to have imagined a lost room in Jacobean Norfolk, that vanished muniment room of Stewkey Hall, crammed with its bundles of papers in boxes, tied together with sheepskin thongs, or in later years, lawyers' pink tape. Now, those papers are scattered across the world. Some are still here in Norfolk, but some are in Washington, D.C., Boston, California, even in southern Australia. One of them, which is a really interesting letter of 1579, in which Nathaniel's formidable father, Nicholas, gives him a brisk telling off, came to light only while this volume 8 was being finished. It reappeared in the Town Museum of Watton, just down the road. But after some heroic last-minute adjustments, it stands in sequence in the book, correctly placed just before the covering letter for it, and that covering letter is in a completely different archive across the Atlantic in the USA. Well, some years ago, I undertook an infinitely easier task in publishing the letters of Nathaniel's elder brother, Nicholas, of Redgrave and Culford Halls in Suffolk. Now there, I had merely one library to consult, although it was admittedly far away in Chicago, where the papers were taken in the 1920s. Knowing what I had to do...
Can you step back a little bit? I haven't found the volume. Sorry about the buzz.
Oh, there's a buzz.
The mic's a bit hot.
Oh, right. I'll keep away from it.
I'm trying to get the merger on the phone.
Right, I'm going to put this up here, which means that I can stand back a bit from the lectern. Okay, shall I continue?
Yes.
Right.
Hopefully I'll get it fixed.
Thank you very much. Well, we're with Nathaniel Bacon's brother, Nicholas, in Suffolk. And these papers, all in Chicago, knowing what I had to do for that edition, it is both satisfying and reassuring to turn to the small print in this volume, to see each individual tesseron in the mosaic of sources from which the sequence of documents is derived, and to read the meticulous explanations of how an undated item can indeed be dated and fitted into the flow of all the thousands of documents presented here. And there is much more to marvel at, which only becomes fully apparent when you line up these volumes together, beginning with the first, published nearly 50 years ago in 1979. The sheer span of the series makes its own contribution to how we write history. The acknowledgements at the beginning of Volume 1 express Hasselmith's thanks to giants of the historical profession whose careers stretch back before the Second World War. Names like Joel Hurstfield, Louis B. Wright, which are well out of the consciousness of any historian younger than me. And the method adopted in 1979 was right on the technological forefront of what could then be done in publishing. Gillian Baker transcribed the texts on an electric typewriter ready-made for the edition, cutting out so much of the work then normally taken for granted in publishing. How exciting and enterprising that seemed then. And then came the computer, the laptop, the iPhone, digital resources always getting smaller and at the same time more powerful as the years went on. The Stooky project has been like Molière's comic creation Monsieur Jourdain, suddenly discovering that he has been speaking prose all his life. In an age of print, it had cried out for the labor-saving flexibility of the computer screen. Now, looking at the elegantly presented texts and footnotes, we can marvel at what was done without those aids that we now take for granted. And from the outset, there was more. As early as 1979, lurking behind the printed volumes, there was a computer archive of the manuscript material called the Stooky Database, providing rich material for a great flotilla of little scholarly ships to accompany the Norfolk Record Society's ocean liner. Many theses came out of that database. I name it as examples, realizing I will offend many not named, but I take Linda Campbell's MA on the women of Stooky, or Michael Hinman's on some issues in day labouring, or doctorates such as Jan Pittman's Status and Participation in Early Modern England. So much enlightenment about early modern England sprang out of UEA's gift to scholarship, and the use that has been made both of this ongoing printed edition and the data behind it worldwide is incalculable. Yet, the story of the UEA Stooky database provides us with a timely warning about the technology of history in our own age. The trouble was that it was indeed the technology of its age. It has nearly been lost forever. It has taken the skill and persistence of someone who knows about IT and all its perils to bring it back from oblivion. Now that's of real importance to the volumes that we're celebrating, since the early volumes in the series consistently refer in their footnotes to what they call the UEA database, references which would now be pointless if the database had vanished. So among many other heroes of this story, we salute lifeboatman Neil Howe's rescue voyages for making those references meaningful and useful once more. And what has this all been about? Who was the man on whom these multitude of lenses have been focused by the Norfolk Record Society? Perhaps an audience in Norfolk has less need than any other in the world to be lectured on Sir Nathaniel Bacon, but maybe you need your memory refreshing. Let me call it all back to you. First, by taking you to my own childhood county of Suffolk, and to Nathaniel's father, the great lawyer, Sir Nicholas Bacon. He was a Suffolk boy like me, and the links between our two counties are interwoven through the story of the Bacons and all the Stooky papers. Nicholas Bacon was the son of the sheep reeve to the Abbot of St Edmundsbury, which sounds like a humble office, but it wasn't really in the vast estates of a wealthy Benedictine monastery. There was already something special about the Bacon family, as you can see if you go to their splendid parish church at Hessett, near Bury St Edmunds. Those Bacons loved the Abbey of Bury, and because at the time they had no heraldry of their own, they covered Hessett Church, this church, with emblems of Bury Abbey. Go and have a look. And you can see them still there. And one of Nicholas's close Bacon relatives at Hessett was a master builder of churches, especially church towers. And so these late medieval Bacons lie under stone tombs in Hessett churchyard. There's one of them. Very unusual for late medieval yeomen to have these outside stone memorials in a church, but they did stone. You feel standing there that they had a great sense of style, which the boy Nicholas certainly inherited, though perhaps style was not the big thing for his second son, Nathaniel. Nicholas Bacon grew up and left that tiny enclave of rural Bacon splendour up to London, and he made his way in the legal profession to play on a much greater stage. He had immense energy, talent, wide cultural interests. He was one of a group of gifted administrators who rose by their talents to rule England in the reigns of Henry VIII and his children. Such men had been fostered by two clever men who had also risen by their wits. First, the Suffolk boy turned Oxford Don and then Cardinal, Thomas Wolsey, and then Wolsey's brilliant servant, Thomas Cromwell, whom now we know in book, film and stage, thanks to the wonderful, much-missed Dame Hilary Mantel. And in the 1530s, the talented young protégés of Wolsey and Cromwell worked their way up the Tudor system, mostly Cambridge graduates and mostly Protestant. By the end of the 16th century, their moment had passed, but meanwhile they had risen to rule the country, turn it away from Rome towards the Reformation, and hand it on to their children. Among them were two great statesmen of Elizabethan England, who became brothers-in-law. Sir William Cecil, founder of the great dynasty still living at Hatfield House, and Sir Nicholas Bacon. It is their sons we're meeting in the Bacon papers. Here is Nicholas in his splendour, his highest office achieved in the reign of Elizabeth I as her first Lord Keeper of the Great Seal, one of the major offices of state. It could have been Lord Chancellor. That was the greater title, and it was the title which his son Francis was to hold in later years. And Elizabeth didn't make him a peer of the realm either, odd, but perhaps she felt he was a bit too much of a Suffolk yeoman still. Nevertheless, at the Lord Keeper's death in 1579, the Queen acknowledged his greatness with a magnificent funeral in Old St. Paul's Cathedral and a tomb to match, a burial place next to the tomb of John of Gaunt. And you can still see the fire-blackened torso of Sir Nicholas Bacon's effigy from the tomb, and there it is in the crypt of the new St. Paul's. I'm sorry there's so much sun here. Now, Sir Nicholas Bacon went on to have two very contrasting sets of children by two successive wives. First came a crop of three sons by the wife who suited his unspectacular early years. His first wife, Jane Fernley, was daughter to a local Suffolk yeoman from Creting, much the same social level as the Bacons of Hessett. Then, after Anne's death, with Nicholas Bacon's career considerably further up the social scale, there came a marriage to a brilliant and forceful woman, Anne Cook, daughter to a clever Protestant gentleman of Essex, Her sister Mildred Cook married William Cecil, who was later Queen Elizabeth's minister, Lord Burleigh. In either of Nicholas's marriages, one suspects that the children matched the wife. From Anne Fernley, the yeoman's daughter, came 3 solid, plodding boys: Nicholas the younger, Nathaniel, and Edward. They made a decent show of being country gentlemen, county gentlemen, a very decent show in the case of Nathaniel. But you feel that even all Lord Keeper Bacon's power behind them, that was as far as they were ever going to go. Very different were the sons of Anne Cook, Anthony and the famous Francis Bacon. These two were fiercely clever, both gay, and both destined for a place on the national stage. In the case of Francis, a lawyer who outdid, as I've said, his father by becoming Lord Chancellor and much more, a philosopher of international significance. Now, what is very interesting about the Stookey correspondence, as well as the Redgrave correspondence that I edited, is that Francis and Anthony hardly figure in them at all. Now, that may be because the relevant bundles of letters have been removed for a variety of reasons, but it's just as likely that the two sets of brothers were not really soulmates. They were, in fact, chalk and cheese, or perhaps sheep corn and wood pasture, a phrase which Hassel Smith loved to use to describe the two halves of the county of Norfolk. But before this became apparent, in the 1540s, the rising lawyer, Nicholas Bacon, bought an estate in northern Suffolk, spoil from the destruction of his family's old patron's Bury Abbey in Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries. It lay at Redgrave, in the northernmost part of Suffolk, almost in Norfolk, what one of my Suffolk farmer friends calls the demilitarised zone. Redgrave was very neatly placed, very near the centre of Norfolk and Suffolk. It was a proper Bacon HQ for East Anglia, significantly close, in fact, to another rival great HQ for East Anglia, the Duke of Norfolk's palace at Kenninghall. The Lord Keeper clearly planned Redgrave to be one of his principal residences, along with a house in Hertfordshire nearer London, Gorhambury Hall. His eldest son, Nicholas, naturally inherited Redgrave on Lord Keeper Bacon's death, while the younger son, Nathaniel, was set up in North Norfolk in a very idiosyncratic but very stylish house which the Lord Keeper was building at Stookey. Oh, sorry, that's Redgrave, by the way. Quick glance at Redgrave, E-shaped, very large. Let's go straight to Stookey, as it appeared in fairly recent years. The third son, Edward, was placed elsewhere, near Ipswich, a place called Shrubland Hall, after being married to the heiress of Shrubland. There's not much left of building of Edward's period at Shrubland, as you may know, large Victorian house there now. But what remains at Stookey is extraordinary, with its bizarre round towers, surely a tribute to the round towers of Norfolk churches, turned into Renaissance ornaments. So if you look at a map of East Anglia between the 1540s and 1560s, Lord Keeper Bacon made sure that his newly arrived dynasty was neatly distributed in a triangle shape across eastern England, ready to challenge the position of older aristocratic families like the Howard Dukes of Norfolk if opportunity arose. So we have Redgrave, we have Shrubland, we have Stookey. In part, the chance came when the Howard fortunes crashed when the fourth Howard Duke was executed in 1572. But great plans rarely go quite as you think they will. Rather than the Bacons stepping into the vacuum left by the Howards in East Anglia, they became one set of players in a contest where there were many contenders. and the Howards themselves were down but not out after 1572, as we discover in the Stookey Papers. In his brilliant study of politics in Tudor Norfolk, Hassell emphasised this and described an Elizabethan Norfolk in which the contest for running the county had as few rules as a Tudor village football match. Although in neighbouring Suffolk, matters were a good deal more orderly, as I discovered in my own research, a real contrast between the two counties. In his last years, Lord Keeper Bacon chose to spend most of his time outside East Anglia at Gorhambury, not far from his now equally powerful statesman brother-in-law, Sir William Cecil. Bacon had too many sons and too much affection for them to allow his great estates throughout the southeast of England to remain as a unit. There was never going to be a ducal scale Bacon estate to match what the Howards repeatedly reconstructed out of their various disasters. The Lord Keeper gave the three sons of his first marriage a rigorous training in the running of county affairs, and they all remained country squires of distinctly Puritan outlook, to varying degrees critical of the Protestant church settlement which Lord Keeper Bacon himself had helped to create in 1559, the Elizabethan settlement. The eldest boy, the second Nicholas, did, in James I's reign, achieve the honour of becoming the premier baronet of England when James created baronets for the first time. But still, I think he was something of a disappointment to his father. He was not the material for a statesman, and he was sometimes very slow in doing what the Lord Keeper saw as his duty. There are some fine sarcastic tellings off in the Bacon letters of young Nicholas. Nathaniel did rather better, not so many tellings off. He inherited his father's capacity for hard work and attention to detail, and he had a sense of duty, which made him one of the leading administrators of Elizabethan Norfolk. Edward, frankly, was nothing special, but they all played their part in the Puritan oligarchy which over several generations dominated East Anglian politics from the 1570s through to the restoration of Charles II. From time to time, the Howards and their clients challenged them and their allies once more, but neither side ever really triumphed, and eventually new alliances took over. Yet, here in Norfolk, the lineal and collateral descendants of the Bacons remain, still with their historic place in East Anglian society. They have played their part in supporting and contributing manuscripts to this great enterprise we're celebrating tonight. Throughout the Bacon Papers, then, we see the expanding career of Nathaniel among the three brothers of the elder Bacon line. He became firmly established among the leading administrators of Norfolk. He went on building at the house at Stookey, which the Lord Keeper had begun, although he didn't show the same zest for architecture and gardens which his father had shown. And in fact, the original design was never finished. Here it is. Nathaniel had no surviving son, and when he married off his daughters, it was not without trouble and complication, much of which was caused by his own ineptitude in emotional matters. That's obvious in what few personal papers survive in this collection. For all his worldly success, Sir Nathaniel Bacon seems an unhappy figure. Virtually the only humour in his correspondence occurs in letters from his sister, who is happily married far off in the home counties. And these are the most personal items of all those surviving. Hassell Smith put a great deal of effort into reconstructing Nathaniel's patterns of hospitality and expenditure, and he quickly noticed Nathaniel's remarkable lack of contact with his gentry neighbours, except on business. The account books show that they never came to dinner at Stookey. and they rarely wrote to him except on administrative matters. Small wonder that this lonely, energetic man turned to religion and politics to fill his days. His papers are a portrait of the public activities and preoccupations of a driven do-gooder, born to the role, poor man. Throughout his life, Bacon was on the lookout for signs of corruption and mismanagement in church and commonwealth, and his papers were full of evidence patiently collected for some further campaign against the forces of darkness. In Norfolk, the forces of darkness were usually personified in another, equally crotchety, but perhaps more sociable Norfolk magnate, Sir Arthur Henningham, and Henningham's ally at court as well, the Lord Lieutenant Henry Lord Hunsdon. These are the bad guys in the contest. And the rows were just endless. There were rows about attempts to raise money for repairs to roads and coastal defences, or to close down technically illegal country food shops. There were spats over providing properly qualified parish clergy, or over collection of what was known as purveyance, to save the Crown money in its food by charging lower rates than commercial values. It was a right of the Crown, but it could be abused, and Nathaniel thought it often was. A long-running legal sore was the legal title of the dean and chapter of Norwich Cathedral to their estates. Did they have any lands or not? Quite a few people hoped that they didn't. In all this, Bacon played the role of the archetypal Puritan country gentleman. He sniffed out jobbery and misuse of the royal prerogative. He bemoaned the half-reformed state of the Church of England. Frequently, he bore such grievances up to Westminster as Knight of the Shire at Parliament time. The country outlook did not mean that his horizons were narrow. He kept a keen ear open for gossip from the capital or from abroad, and for a Puritan, he showed a surprising relish for winning sums of money at cards. Soon after James I came to the throne, in 1604, Bacon finally achieved the knighthood, which his elder brother had already enjoyed for a quarter of a century. It may have been this long-awaited honour which at last prompted Nathaniel to finish off Stukey Hall, though it was a design reduced from Lord Keeper Bacon's original. Appropriately, for a Puritan squire, his house recycled popish monastic stone from Walsingham Priory, now put to godly use. Then, almost immediately after his knighthood, Nathaniel bought up the elements for a brand new landed estate in the parish of Ermingland, and he began building a second house there. Now, the younger Nicholas Bacon, soon after his knighthood, had likewise bought a second estate and mansion in Suffolk. A second home was an absolutely necessary status symbol for someone who aspired to be a real magnate in his country. Yet all the time in these Jacobean years, there was the shadow of Nathaniel's unhappy and childless second marriage to Dorothy Smith. It hardly figures in these volumes of so much correspondence, except in the shadowy form of Suffolk business brought by his wife's estates from her first marriage, and much of that business came in the shape of problems. Victor Morgan, in a masterly introduction to one volume in this series, speculates that the lack of personal papers, which after 1600 becomes absolutely obvious, is the result of deliberate weeding by the faithful Martin Man at the death of St. Nathaniel. All that's left is the evidence of the relentless activity, parliamentary, local, political, ecclesiastical, administrative. It's an office archive rather than the record of a human being's home and relaxation. Well, that's entirely plausible. The weeding theory seems to me to work. In history, silences are often as eloquent as what is said. I think of other great manuscript collections from this period, which have rather similar yawning gaps to tell us a significant story by the gap. One is the huge archive of Thomas Cromwell, where, as I read through it all, I read every paper within it. It's quite clear that what that archive is his in tray, the letters written to him. The out tray, his letters out, are missing, and they would have existed in a copy. The clerk's last copy would be filed in the archive. They're not there in this most meticulous of Tudor statesmen. Why? The reason, I think, is that when the great man fell from royal favour and power, his loyal household spent a busy day or two burning the out tray, on the grounds that what Cromwell had written would be far more likely to provide ammunition for his enemies than what people had written to him. And that still left the faithful servants an impressive pile of papers, thousands on thousands of them, to thrust into the hands of the royal agents who arrived to confiscate Cromwell's archive. Never think that even a very big historical archive is complete. And of course, the fascination of the Bacon papers has always, in a very different sense, been that they are fragments of a story. They provide one perspective on the history of a kingdom where such men as the Bacons were very conscious of their part in what they were increasingly learning to call a state. These knights, esquires, and gentlemen were local magnates. But thanks to the astute political sense of the Tudor dynasty, they were also proud representatives of the English crown, bound to the life of the court and the Westminster law courts. Let alone the High Court of Parliament, which Vic Morgan astutely observed was by now becoming an institution in expectation. Back home in the counties and shire, the work of a JP, Justice of the Peace, or a Deputy Lieutenant, was as much about what happens between official meetings as in them. And these volumes turn out to be especially strong on Bacon's role as a mediator in local disputes, sometimes on the request of judges in Westminster or courtiers in Whitehall, sometimes simply by virtue of being recognised as a venerable and just man. And I can't think of any other Puritan gentleman in England whose papers show how clearly it was possible to think that the Church of England was but half reformed, but who worked within it, and rather than against the Elizabethan settlement. There are so many ways in which we can use these collections to illustrate the complex ways in which centre and locality related to each other in Tudor and Stuart England. After the collapse of the Howard dynasty in Elizabeth's reign, the new King James spurred on a cautious rebuilding of Howard power, which had been taking shape in the 1590s. Now, Henry Howard, Earl of Northampton, younger brother of the executed 4th Duke of Norfolk, returned in 1605 as Norfolk and Suffolk's most senior administrative officer for military matters, the Lord Lieutenant. That put into shade the group of senior gentlemen, including Nathaniel, who were called the Commissioners for Musters. They had previously run Norfolk's armed forces, but now they had to become the Earl's deputy lieutenants. Now, Northampton was a crypto-Catholic, a secret Catholic, not that secret actually, and his sexuality was as ambiguous as his religion. So there were very many reasons why Nathaniel Bacon might find this a difficult appointment. And one major letter in the collection in the 1600s is from Northampton to his new deputies. but it shows just how careful he was to conciliate them. One long-standing grievance for leading Norfolk gentlemen was the appointment of a professional to run the military forces here, a professional muster master, undertaking the daily actual running. They hated it. They wanted to be in charge, and it was one of the many issues on which they clashed with central government, particularly with the previous Lord Lieutenant in the time of Elizabeth, Lord Hunsdon. Now, Northampton listened to their decided opinions that Norfolk didn't need a muster master, and then silkily declared, "I am resolved, so far as it may rest in me, to spare the country the charge." In other words, you win. A soft answer turneth away wrath. Not all representatives of central government felt the need to be so tactful with local gentlemen. We can read a furious and immensely long letter from the Privy Council to the Norfolk Subsidy Commissioners, the tax collectors, who were largely senior county JPs, Nathaniel among them. It detailed their many blatant sharp practices in doing themselves and their county a favour when assessing values for taxation. Under-assessing for tax had steeply diminished the money that taxation raised for the Crown. Those who read the Council's letters might well have reflected that one of its signatories was Robert Cecil, Earl of Salisbury, whose much revered father, William Cecil Lord Burleigh, had done precisely the same thing with his own tax return as assessor and taxpayer in Hertfordshire. It was a problem which neither the Tudors nor the early Stuarts ever solved. Oliver Cromwell and his successors did rather better. Let's consider a different way of slicing through these volumes, the light that it sheds on people outside the charmed circle of the gentry, those whom they would regard as their inferiors. There are some startling pages in these volumes where we're actually given some tiny word portraits of a large number of ordinary Suffolk men whose physical appearances would otherwise be entirely lost. And that was for the very good reason that when it came to impressing men for the Navy, it was necessary to know what they looked like. The man pressed might vanish from the scene or find a physically weedy substitute who would be bound to be rejected by the pressmen when he turned up for duty. So, despite the intervening centuries, we know that among the sailors of Salthouse, James Housigo, 20 years old, was of a reasonable stature with a short black beard. Thomas Parr was of a middle stature with a black head and beard. And George Clark, 30 years old, was of a mean stature with a lean face and without a beard. And those are the ones who got away with a discharge. This list is a gallery of 40 faces long, and it provides a straw poll of Jacobean facial hair fashions in North Norfolk. Equally unexpectedly, from these papers it might not have been immediately obvious, without a letter from Mrs. Margaret Barney of Gunton, that the collapse of Gunton Church Tower led to a sudden need for a local alehouse. The influx of workmen rebuilding the church needed a handy source of beer and food while they were building, and tiny Gunton village simply had nothing licensed. Now that rather puts in perspective a common cliché in oversimplified social history about alehouse culture and church culture being opposed to each other. No, you needed both. In a certain sort of modern newspaper, or no doubt on social media now, there are frequent complaints about the nanny state. And it would be good to balance such whinging with a dose of Jacobean history. Looking through Nathaniel Bacon's papers makes you realise that for the villages around Stewkey, Nathaniel Bacon was the nanny state. There's very much which is familiar in his intervention in local affairs, and also familiar is the public reaction of shock when the nanny state is not doing enough nannying. We read of a Peter Grimes of former days, a man called George Phillips of Dunton, who for 5 years miserably ill-treated, starved, and left scantily clad his apprentice in tannery, Peter Housigo, until eventually the lice-ridden, fatally sick 20-year-old dragged himself back to his widowed mother's house to die. A wretched detail in this story is that for half a year the boy had been too ashamed to go to church after Easter because his clothes were not up to an appearance in public. We can understand that early modern government should worry about plague, corn supply, export, defence and drink licensing, but the pervasive interference in private morality is something very alien to us now. Society's punitive obsession with what it called bastardy must have blighted and brought shame to countless lives. So, Margaret Hillington of Town Barningham and Robert Pynchon of Kelling were both publicly whipped in the town marketplace at Holt after her child appeared, shades of modern Iran. Of course, it was as much about money as morality. Illegitimate children were likely to have no family to support them. And it was for that reason that Robert Pynchon was carted off to jail until he could find guarantors for his promise of 4p a week maintenance payment for the mother. This was a world where coercion was much more violent than in ours, precisely because officialdom was so much less assured in its reach. No reliable police force, no probation service, virtually no long-term prisons. Instead, there was the whip, and then there was hellfire. If we draw back from all this detail in the Stookie Papers, we can be guided to see the greater but much slower, long-term changes lying behind the busy march of events in Nathaniel Bacon's world over more than half a century. Overall, these changes helped to draw England towards a sort of stability amid rapid change that the modern West might envy. By 1622, his death, there was much more wealth through society than there had been when Nathaniel was born, and there were more people to profit from it by calling themselves gentlemen and build many more stately homes. Even for relatively poor people, there were new possibilities of using their new leisure, their little extra money, to start enjoying themselves, to have disposable income, a new idea for most of them. For instance, in the first sightings of that English drug of choice for the next 4 centuries, tobacco. And within these changes, there was something of profound importance going on. There was a slow tipping of the yeoman and middling sort, that distinctive social level below the gentry, away from their social inferiors towards the preoccupations of those above them in the social order. These yeomen were the people who had once led popular rebellions, such as that of Robert Kett in 1549. But by the 17th century, they were much less inclined to disrupt their society in such ways. Instead, they were the people who supported the hyperactivity of Nathaniel Bacon and the complex infrastructure that kept his family and estates afloat. It took King Charles I to provoke yeomen, gentry, and nobility to unite in fury and fight their king, and in the end, execute him. Well, I've noted this phenomenon myself in my contemplation of Tudor rebellions. And there seems to me one factor which is crucial in this shift, which is very relevant to the books we're celebrating tonight. Words on pages, and who could read those words. Between 1550 and 1580, the illiteracy of yeomen in the Diocese of Norwich fell dramatically from about 60% to about 30%. And in the Diocese of Exeter, another sample, even more steeply than that, from 75% illiterate to 35% illiterate. From then on, a majority of the middling sort of craftsmen and small farmers, even in small villages, were literate. At the same time, their social inferiors, the husbandmen and labourers, remained steadily illiterate between 75 and 100% right down to the 19th century. Thus, in the lifetime of Nathaniel Bacon, literacy developed a social and political revolution. Literate culture was the culture of the powerful. Yeoman society began taking on the ways of the world of power. For instance, their wills and the inventories of their possessions reveal that they might treasure musical instruments like virginals in their homes. They were now relabeled as the better sort of the parish. They became the backbone of the system of select vestries, poor law administration, which from the end of the 16th century made the parishes of England increasingly tightly defended against disorder and the self-assertion of the lower orders. Many of these people took with enthusiasm to the new respectable activism of Puritan religion. Nathaniel Bacon was their role model. So such men were less inclined to use violence to express their anger. They would take their grievances to the royal law courts and turn up in their hundreds or even thousands to vote in county elections to Parliament. There might be plenty of excitement and brawling on the election day in 1603 when Nathaniel became senior knight of the Shire, but it was far from the slaughter of Kett's army outside Norwich on Moushold Heath in 1549. Bacon made his own contribution to that outcome, and the 8 volumes of his papers are a more eloquent memorial to him than his own modest and undemonstrative funeral monument on the wall of Stookie Church. You will hardly be able to see it. Oh, just. But let me tell you, it's not very impressive. These volumes are his memorial. We are not simply riding on a pleasant sea of antiquarian detail here. We have a chance to understand the roots of our own world, reflect on our own time with all its troubles, worries, and opportunities. Nathaniel's presence in Stookie was one fleeting moment amid the centuries of life and death on the Norfolk coast. All these centuries later, Nathaniel might be surprised that the last days and second coming of Christ have not yet appeared, though he might also be a little disappointed. We human beings are still here. Maybe we can hope that there may be human beings left to be surprised 4 centuries after our own time. If we can give as much to the society around us as he gave to his, that would not be a bad epitaph to have. Perhaps better than this little monument at Stookie. Thank you.
Well, Merriman, thank you very much. Despite the piercing feedback, my panicked interruption, and the sun slowly coming your way, that was a wonderfully graceful and erudite talk. Dermot is willing to take a few questions, if we have, before we close. Simply raise your hand.
You find a way of getting out of the sun. Yes. Yeah, I'm okay.
I was sitting over there thinking, I really wish we would have started at 6. Yes, a question about, let me bring the microphone back to you just a minute.
Thank you, that was fascinating. Are there any successive papers that your successors or others are following up with following Nathaniel's?
You mean collections from the Tudor Stuart period?
Or even later?
There are. Norfolk is peculiarly rich in such papers. and there are many people in this audience who will know that better than me. Suffolk, not so much. And I think that is to do with the rhythms of the destruction of country houses, which in Suffolk I think started earlier. And so before the age when people were interested in buying them up and taking them to Chicago. But Norfolk is extraordinarily, peculiarly rich in such collections. The papers of Sir Arthur Henningham emerged in the 1970s, to my delight, to Hassel's delight, from a solicitor's office in Aylsham. And they were classically bound up in pink tape. So I went through them eagerly after Hassel had. And they're so illuminating. I don't know if the Society have any thoughts about publishing them?
We would welcome any editor who is keen to do so for us. Any other questions? Well, if not, oh, at the back. Sorry, I didn't see your hand. 1 second.
Thanks very much again. Is there any sense in which the papers make reference to the appearance of the strangers and their impact on life in Norfolk? Because I think last year at this festival we had a wonderful talk that talked about some of the strangers being sort of activists in terms of pursuing their sort of propaganda aims against Spain in the 80 Years' War. So that sense they were not just here to revolutionise industry, but they actually were pursuing their own political goals. And I wondered if there's any sense that Nathaniel's reflecting on this change to county life as well.
I'm not sure there's much on that, and there is an ambiguity in the attitude to strangers, because they're very much commercial competitors, and that became clear in various outbreaks of ill will at the end of the 1560s. But they are also religious refugees who you wish to save from popish tyranny in mainland Europe. The same thing happened again with the Huguenots, particularly when Louis XIV betrayed his ancestors' promises and threw them out in the 1680s and 90s. And they are made very welcome here. It's an example of this country welcoming immigrants in a rather uncomplicated way, perhaps because they gradually faded into the general population. Well, the same thing will happen with few later present waves of immigration. But this was so much a constantly, consciously ideological welcome that it marched in step with the regime, particularly those of Puritan outlook. The Reformed Protestant, the definite Reformed Protestants in the elite would be those who would wish to see them do well. And of course they would eventually get churches in cities like Norwich, Canterbury and London. There were no fewer than, I think, 20 French Huguenot churches in London in the 1690s. So that's the scale we're talking about.
I think as well, anyone interested in the strangers, it might be worth me flagging up that in a couple of years' time, we'll be publishing a volume of documents relating to the strangers. Christopher Joby, who's often around the city, he's occasionally here speaking on the strangers. He's editing that volume for us, which I think is due to be out in 2028, if I remember off the top of my head. But we have a question here.
Thanks. First, that was an absolutely splendid overview of the bacon, most enjoyable. But I want to take issue with you when you present the Bacon Boys as rather stolid lads who won't make it big time in the metropolis and around the court. It may be true of Edward, perhaps, but it seems to me that, in some ways, having spent rather too many decades living with Nathaniel, I'm not inclined to defend him most times, but this time perhaps I will. I think one of the things is that in the wider culture, there is this notion of the court and the country and where morality resides. And You therefore get people like Francis Bacon, the spider at the web of the Elizabethan security service, as it were, writing pieces saying, you know, the only moral place to be is in the countryside. And I think people at the time, and I think the Bacon boys as well, were in a sense making a choice when they decided that they wanted to live in their houses and build their houses and not get tied up with all the iniquities that they knew went on at court.
Thanks. That's all fair comment. And they do, of course, go to Parliament and express themselves very vigorously there. So I'm with you, I think, except that we have this really quite dramatic contrast in the Bacon family between the two sets of boys. You've got the three Fernley boys, then you've got the two Cook boys, and their careers are so startlingly different. That, I think, reflects some sort of reality in the family, and the way in which Lord Keeper Bacon was so constantly chiding the boys, Nathaniel, Nicholas, Edward. He's a hard taskmaster, but he wants them to be better. He wants them to be as good as he is, frankly, which is a pretty cruel standard to carry out, but it's there. So I do take the point.
One more at the back.
Thank you very much for, as the gentleman behind me said, a fascinating talk. I speak purely as a newcomer to this subject or this area, but I just wonder whether either Professor McCulloch or indeed whether this is a question really for the Society, whether from the work that's been done on these papers and the knowledge that people have of them, the themes that you drew out towards the end of your fascinating talk about, as you put it, I think how you can, there's real evidence here of the foundation of the modern state in various ways, and looking at it in the Norfolk perspective, whether there is scope for another study working across the papers, or what has now been published, to draw out those themes, or whether it's already been done elsewhere, but whether there is a possibility of projecting Nathaniel Bacon a little further for a more general audience, if I may put it that way, drawing from the publications that have been done until now and which today is celebrating.
I'm sure such a project would be good. So much work has been done. Thanks very much to Hassel and that generation of regional historians. And it was so exciting and new in the 1970s that getting the papers out there is a major achievement, but also the way in which they pioneered thinking about them. But we haven't finished that yet. And younger scholars can go on, now that this marvellous resource is there, to do precisely the sort of things you're talking about, and to consider the different ways in which England behaves at any one time. What happened in East Anglia in the 16th, 17th century was very different from what happened in Lancashire, which was actually much more like what happened in the Pale of Dublin at the time, and that we should be looking beyond the bounds of the Kingdom of England to try and understand how these patterns shift and are characteristic of wider areas. So you raise a very good point, and it's rather cheering to think how much more could be extracted from these sort of papers.
One of the things that you discover being involved in a record society like this is that you never know when the things that you publish are going to be used. It might be immediately, it might be 50, 60, 70 years down the road, or even longer. And so you have to, in many ways, take a leap of faith on the good scholarship that you produce and on the quality of the material that you produce, trusting that in time to come, the right people will come along and use it to a good purpose. And I'm sure that will be the case with the 8 volumes of the papers of Nathaniel Bacon. That seems a fitting point to end on. And before we thank Dermot, I'll just say a thanks to all of you who have come along this evening and for the staff who have helped out here, both from UEA and from the History Festival. Thank you very much for your help. Thanks everyone for your patience with the feedback, apologies, and the sun. And finally, can we give a vote of thanks to Dermot McCulloch? There is plenty of time, so if you'd like to mill about and talk, please do look at our volumes on the table back at the back of the church if you're interested, and have a lovely evening.
Actually, Ripon, exploded. I had to keep stopping because it also stopped the sound. Yeah. Except we'll need to because of the sun. Can't put it there because of the water. Gosh, isn't that wonderful? Yeah. And how did you discover it?
It was beautiful. I was creating one of the course of history section in the museum I work with trustees.
Yeah.
And I got everything down to 1600s and I wanted some 1500s. And I got my mother's cycles from Stifkin.
Right.
So I spotted this in the Rose Auction in London.
Right.
Yes, not realising it's historical significance. Because I'm primarily a philatelist, not a postal historian.
Right.
So when I saw it, I couldn't resist.
Yes, that's amazing. Yes.
this is mine.